The first time the Galactic Council chamber heard the word diplomacy paired with humanity, it was spoken with a thin edge of amusement because the assembled delegates had already decided the outcome before the human envoy finished clearing his throat. The chamber itself, a vast ring of floating platforms orbiting a miniature star that cast a ceremonial glow over representatives who measured age in millennia and power in fleets. And from their perspective, the humans were latecomers who spoke softly, arrived with empty hands, and insisted on protocols instead of threats. So when Daniel Mercer stood at the center dais wearing a plain dark suit with no visible insignia beyond the small blue and white emblem of Earth on his lapel and calmly requested mediation regarding the Varelian advance into the Sair Fringe, several delegates exchanged color shifts, posture flays, or pheromonal signals that translated cleanly into the same sentiment. Why are the fragile biped pretending they matter? Because the Varelians were conquerors by reputation, their fleet sharp-edged and efficient, their doctrine built around decisive force, and the Fringe was considered a buffer zone no one important cared to defend. Yet Mercer spoke anyway, his voice steady as he outlined population counts, evacuation corridors, and proposal for monitored withdrawal that would preserve trade lanes and prevent civilian loss. And when he finished, the chamber responded with polite silence followed by the clicking laughter of a Keth observer who remarked that humans were admirably earnest for a species that had not yet lost a homeworld, to which Mercer replied without heat that earnestness was the point, that the council existed to prevent loss before it occurred, and the laughter grew louder, even sympathetic delegates like the avian Tallarans offering gentle admonitions that diplomacy required leverage and humanity had not yet earned any. But Mercer did not retreat. He reminded them of treaties, signed after first contact, of clauses promising mutual aid to developing members, and of the Council's own charter language about the sanctity of life, words that sounded old-fashioned in a chamber use accounting tonnage and kill ratios, and so the mockery turned casual, a Phyrexian warlord noting that humans spoke as if they could enforce consequences, and Mercer answered that consequences existed whether acknowledged or not, a line that earned him a formal reprimand for implied threats, yet even then he remained composed, requesting observers be sent, corridors opened, time bought, because time was what the refugees and the Fringe needed, and when the motion failed by a wide margin, the council chair formally thanked humanity for its passion and suggested they focus on internal development instead of galactic policing. And the session ended with a Varelian ambassador offering Mercer a smile that showed too many teeth and promising swift resolution, which in Varelian dialect meant annihilation. And as Mercer left the chamber, he transmitted a short update to Earth that contained no emotion and ended with a simple line, diplomacy exhausted, initiating contingency support, and far from the ceremonial star and the quiet dark beyond map lanes, ships that did not carry transponders altered course with practiced precision. Because humanity had learned early that diplomacy worked best when backed by the ability to keep promises, even the ones you hoped never to make. While the Council returned to its routines and the Varelian fleets advanced with clockwork confidence, the Sair Fringe burned in smaller, quieter ways that never made it to official channels, because out there diplomacy meant a mother counting oxygen canisters while listening to distant bombardment, and a station master choosing which docking ring to vent to by another hour. And it was into this chaos that the first human relief ships arrived without announcement, unarmed by galactic standards, and flying profiles that flagged them as civilian auxiliaries, which was exactly why the Varelian patrols ignored them at first, assuming they were scavengers or naive volunteers, and Captain Aisha Rahman of the vessel Solace used that assumption the way an old sailor uses a current, letting it carry her ship through corridors of destruction while her crew worked in practiced silence, docking, loading, undocking, again and again, pulling thousands out of habitats that had been written off as lost. And every evacuee heard the same calm reassurance that sounded rehearsed because it was, "You are safe now. Stay seated. Medical teams will see you shortly." And when Varelian commanders finally noticed the evacuation numbers dropping faster than projected, they lodged formal protests accusing humanity of interference. Protests that were technically correct and strategically useless because interference was not aggression, and the Council's own bylaws protected humanitarian action. Loophole humans had memoized line by line during their first decade among the stars, and so the Varelians escalated the only way they knew how by accelerating their offensive timetable, smashing stations instead of encircling them, which forced Rahman and dozens like her to make harder calls, sometimes arriving minutes too late, sometimes leaving behind beacons broadcasting evacuation coordinates they knew no one else would answer. And back on Earth, Daniel Mercer watched the feeds in the quiet. room with no windows, his face unreadable as casualty projections updated in real time. And when the first human ship took fire while shielding a convoy, the room went still because across a line the galaxy pretended not to see. And Mercer did not call the council, did not issue threats. He simply authorized Phase 2, a phrase that meant nothing to anyone outside a very small circle. And in deep space, the ships that had altered course earlier powered up systems that had been dormant since. Test runs. Not weapons yet. Just engines that bent local physics in subtle ways, allowing them to arrive where sensors said they should not be, and the first Varelian cruiser to encounter a human escort wing died without ever understanding why its targeting solutions kept slipping by fractions of a second, its commanders shouting orders as human vessels maneuvered with an ease that suggested familiarity with chaos itself, disabling drives, carving weapon mounts, never firing on escape pods. Because the objective was not annihilation but removal, and as news of these engagements filtered back through unofficial channels of rumor began to spread among fringe worlds that the humans were coming, not as conquerors, not as saviors, but as something rarer and more unsettling, a species that had asked politely, been laughed at, and then gone to wake. And even in the Galactic Council chamber, some delegates felt a flicker of unease they could not quite name as reports crossed their desks. That did not match the tidy predictions approved only days before, reports that suggested the balance of the situation was changing and that the humans, quiet humans with their earnest words and inconvenient principles, might have been serious all along. By the time the council reconvened to address what was now being called an unexpected complication, the situation in the Serre Fringe had shifted so far from the original projections that several delegates spent the opening minutes arguing about whose data streams were faulty, because the Varelian advance had slowed without any clear fleet engagement on record. Their casualty numbers oddly low, yet their territorial gain stalling as if they were pushing against something invisible, and when the Varelian ambassador finally spoke, his tone lacked the earlier confidence, blaming human interference for destabilizing a lawful campaign and demanding sanctions, at which point Daniel Mercer was granted the floor again more out of irritation than respect. And this time he did not plead for mediation or quote charters. He simply presented footage compiled from dozens of civilian sensors showing evacuation corridors held open under fire, stations preserved long enough to empty, and Varelian warships drifting powerless with precise sections removed as if by surgical instruments, and as the chamber absorbed the images, Mercer explained in the same even voice that humanity had not deployed combat fleets, had not declared war, had merely exercised its right to protect sentient life under existing law, and that any damage inflicted was a result of defensive action taken to ensure the safe withdrawal of non-combatants. Statements that were technically flawless and emotionally infuriating to species accustomed to dominance through force, yet the real shift came when a Talaran analyst quietly confirmed that the maneuver profiles of the human ship suggested predictive models several generations ahead of standard galactic combat doctrine, meaning the humans were not reacting faster, but thinking earlier, shaping battles before they formally began. And this revelation rippled through the chamber because it reframed every prior assumption about human limitations, raising the uncomfortable question of what else they had chosen not to show, and far from political theater the reality was becoming clearer to Varelian commanders on the front lines who found their fleets harried by vessels that never stayed where expected, that appeared in the margins of sensor range and vanished after disabling critical systems, forcing crews into constant high alert without the release of decisive battle, a style of engagement that gnawed at morale and logistics alike, and when a senior Varelian strategist proposed escalating to planetary strikes to force a conclusion, the response from human channels was immediate and chillingly calm, stating that any attempt to target population centers would result in the immediate interdiction of all Varelian assets within the sector, not a threat but a statement of policy, delivered with coordinates and timestamps that demonstrated how thoroughly human observers had mapped the battle space, and it was then that the first whispers began within Varelian ranks about a human rescue fleet rumored to be assembling beyond known lanes, a fleet not yet seen but increasingly felt in the tightening web around their operations, and back on Earth admirals who had spent their careers preparing for wars they hoped never to fight reviewed readiness reports with quiet satisfaction, because everything was proceeding as planned, not toward conquest but toward a single unavoidable truth the galaxy was being forced to confront. That human diplomacy was not weak, it was patient, and patience, when backed by capability and resolve, could be far more dangerous than open aggression. As tension crept from fringes into the core worlds, the Council's internal channels grew crowded with inquiries that all circled the same unspoken fear. How much force could humanity actually bring to bear if pushed? because until now everything they had done fit neatly within defensive framing while still rewriting tactical expectations, and that ambiguity gnawed at species who relied on clear hierarchies of power to feel secure. And it was during this uncertainty that the Varelians made the decision historians would later mark as the moment inevitability set in, authorizing Operation Cleansing Tide, a rapid strike aimed at a densely populated transit hub known to be sheltering evacuees from half a dozen species. The logic brutally simple that if humans wish to play guardians, then the cost of that role will be made unbearable. And when the first salvos were launched, the warning reached human command less than a second after ignition, long enough for Admiral Thomas Hale to close his eyes briefly before issuing the order he had hoped would remain theoretical: deploy the rescue fleet, a phrase that triggered responses across light years as ships that had been drifting in cold silence powered up in unison, not massive dreadnoughts bristling with weapons, but layered formations of carriers, escorts, logistics craft, and mobile hospitals designed to move as a single organism. And when they arrived at the transit hub, they did so in a way no one present would ever forget. Space itself seeming to fold as vessels emerged from angles sensors insisted were impossible, interposing themselves between incoming fire and the station with precision that left no room for error. And for the first time the galaxy witnessed humanity operating without restraint, interception grids flaring, countermeasures blooming like controlled storms. Varelian missiles stripped of guidance and gently nudged off course before being neutralized far from civilian traffic, while boarding teams moved through disabled enemy ships offering surrender terms that were honored exactly as stated, and throughout it all human channels broadcast a single message on repeat: evacuation underway. Do not interfere, a message so calm and consistent it unsettled even Allied observers, because there was no rage in it, no triumph, only an implacable certainty that this outcome had already been decided. And when the last civilian transport cleared the hub, and the station was scuttled by its own automated systems to deny further use, the rescue fleet did not pursue fleeing Varelian elements. It simply held position, a silent wall of steel and light that communicated more than any speech. And across the council chamber, delegates watched the feeds in stunned quiet as analysts confirmed that humanity had just coordinated the largest non-lethal fleet action in recorded history, flawlessly executed under fire, revealing logistical depth and command cohesion that rivaled ancient empires. And Daniel Mercer, observing from the same quiet room on Earth, allowed himself a single exhale because the galaxy had finally seen what he had tried to explain from the beginning, that human diplomacy was not backed by threats or bravado but by preparation, sacrifice, and a willingness to act when words failed. And now that the rescue fleet had arrived and the line had been drawn, there would be no returning to the comfortable fiction that humans were harmless participants in someone else's galaxy. The immediate aftermath of the rescue fleet's appearance was not the explosive escalation many had feared, but something far more destabilizing for the established order. A sudden pause as every major power reassessed its assumptions in real time, because the humans had demonstrated not just force but control, the ability to intervene at scale and then stop, and that restraint unsettled commanders who were used to measuring strength by devastation rather than discipline. And in the Serre fringe, Varelian units found themselves isolated, their supply lines disrupted by human interdiction fields that did not destroy cargo but redirected it, catalogued it, and offered it back under monitored withdrawal agreements that left little room for refusal. And within days entire task groups accepted escorted exits simply because continuing served no strategic purpose. While back in the core worlds, political pressure mounted as allied species quietly asked for clarification of humanity's doctrines, wanting to know whether the rescue fleet represented a temporary response or a standing capability, and the official human answer was frustratingly consistent that it had always existed and would be used when necessary, a statement that forced others to confront the uncomfortable truth that they had never bothered to ask what humans were building while they were being polite. And on the council floor, debates grew sharper as some delegates argued that humanity's actions set a dangerous precedent, while others countered that the precedent had already been set by unchecked aggression. And when the Varelian ambassador demanded condemnation for what he called coercive humanitarianism, a Talaran elder replied that coercion implied choice, and the Varelians had forfeited that when they targeted civilians, a rebuke that drew rare murmurs of approval. And in quieter channel, Varelian internal communications told a darker story of captains struggling to explain to their crews why an enemy that refused to kill them had effectively beaten them, why every attempt at escalation was anticipated and neutralized, and why the humans seemed less interested in victory than in ending the conflict on their own terms, a psychological blow that began to fracture command cohesion. And Admiral Hale, monitoring these developments from a command deck filled with low voices and steady displays. Reminded his staff that this was the most dangerous phase because pride made desperate actors unpredictable, ordering rescue elements to remain on high readiness while diplomatic teams prepared frameworks for the escalation that would allow the Varelians to retreat without total humiliation, because the objective had never changed: save lives, stabilize the region, and teach the galaxy a lesson it would remember without having to be reminded again. And as the Council finally passed a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in the Sayer Fringe, the wording carefully neutral to preserve face, the unspoken understanding was clear to everyone watching. It was not the Council that had stopped the war. It was humanity, and the realization spread outward like a shockwave that the quiet species who spoke of diplomacy had just redefined what that word meant when backed by unwavering resolve and the capability to act decisively when mockery gave way to necessity. In the days following the ceasefire, the galaxy entered a period of uneasy recalibration as fleets held position and diplomats worked overtime to translate battlefield reality into language that could be signed and archived. And nowhere was this tension more visible than within the Varelian hierarchy, where senior leaders faced a truth they had never prepared for: that their doctrine of overwhelming force had failed against an opponent who refused to play by its emotional rules. And as human, liaison teams escorted withdrawing Varelian ships through precisely timed corridors offering technical assistance when systems faltered, resentment mixed with a grudging respect that many Varelian officers struggled to process, because the humans did not gloat, did not demand trophies, and did not broadcast victory. They simply ensured compliance and safety with the same methodical care they had shown civilians. And that consistency began to erode the simplistic narratives of human weakness that had justified the campaign in the first place, while on the Council world delegations quietly requested briefings from human representatives on evacuation logistics, predictive maneuver modeling, and multi-species coordination, questions that revealed how deeply the rescue fleet's performance had shaken long-held assumptions about who truly understood large-scale conflict. And Daniel Mercer, now speaking to a chamber far more attentive than before, outlined principles rather than secrets, emphasizing preparation, redundancy, and an unyielding commitment to protecting non-combatants as force multipliers in their own right, statements that sounded almost moralistic until analysts overlaid them with the hard data, reduced casualties, and accelerated conflict resolution. And beyond politics, a cultural impact spread through trade routes and information nets as stories circulated of human medics treating alien wounded without distinction, of engineers staying behind undamaged stations until the last evacuee was clear, of commanders halting pursuit the moment objectives were met, narratives that contrasted sharply with the galaxy's usual tales of domination, and left many wondering whether humanity's greatest weapon was not its technology, but its refusal to separate power from responsibility. And even Admiral Hale felt the weight of that realization as he authorized a gradual stand-down of the rescue fleet, knowing that every move was now watched and remembered, because the galaxy had crossed a threshold where humans were no longer an afterthought or a curiosity, but a central actor whose choices would shape future conflicts. And as Varelian envoys finally agreed to formal talks under Council oversight, the underlying message was unmistakable. The war had ended not because humanity sought control, but because it had demonstrated that it could impose order without losing itself, a lesson that would linger long after ships returned to port and headlines faded into history. The final accord was signed in a chamber stripped of ceremony where function mattered more than symbolism, and as representatives' affix seals and biometric marks, the galaxy quietly acknowledged that a line had been crossed and could not be uncrossed, because the terms did not crown humanity as overseer or enforcer, but codified something more disruptive, binding protections for civilian populations, mandatory evacuation corridors under neutral oversight, and penalties for violations that would trigger automatic multilateral response led by those best equipped to act, a framework built from the very principles humans had demonstrated rather than preached. And when the Varelian delegation accepted the clauses, their lead envoy did so without defiance, stating plainly that their people had learned the cost of mistaking patience for weakness, words that traveled faster than any official communique and took root across the stars. While in the Sayer Fringe, reconstruction began with human logistics ships arriving alongside local crews, sharing tools, data, and labor, not as benefactors but as partners, and refugees returned to habitat stabilized by systems the rescue fleet had quietly installed during the fighting, systems designed to fail safe and signal early rather than burn bright and die. And on Earth, Daniel Mercer stood before a small audience and declined congratulations. reminding them that diplomacy had not failed but been completed, that words had opened the door and action had kept it from slamming shut on innocent lives, a distinction that mattered to a species that had learned through painful history the price of doing nothing at the right moment. And as the rescue fleet dispersed back into obscurity, its legacy did not fade because every Navy recalibrated training around human-style coordination. Every council debate now included a careful accounting of humanitarian impact, and every ambitious empire weighed its plans against the memory of a calm voice asking politely before moving decisively, and in that quieter, more watchful galaxy humanity found itself neither feared nor adored but understood. A people who would speak first, prepare always, and act without hesitation when the mockery ended and the lives of others were on the line. A reputation earned without conquest and secured without surrender. And as history recorded the episode, it did not name a battle or a war but a correction, the moment the galaxy learned the human diplomacy was not a performance but a promise, and that when the rescue fleet arrived it was never to win applause, only to make sure there were still people left to argue, trade, and live another day.